The Roman Empire, a civilization that stood as a colossus of power and influence for over a millennium, is one of the greatest achievements in human history. At its height in 117 CE under Emperor Trajan, the empire stretched across 3 continents, covering 5 million square kilometers and governing an estimated 60 to 70 million people, about 1/5 of the world's population at the time. Its sprawling cities, interconnected trade networks, and groundbreaking engineering from aqueducts to roads symbolized an unprecedented era of prosperity and unity. Yet despite its grandeur, the empire was not invulnerable. Beneath the surface, structural weaknesses, both political and economic, began to erode its foundation. The roots of the empire's fall trace back to the 3rd century CE, during a period now known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. Between 235 and 284 CE, Rome saw more than 50 claimants to the imperial throne, with most of them meeting violent ends. The political chaos destabilized the empire's governance, leading to regional fragmentation and weakening its central authority. This period also witnessed economic turmoil, as heavy taxation and inflation crippled the population. The empire's currency, once backed by precious metals, had been debased repeatedly, leading to rampant inflation that eroded public trust in Roman coinage. The external pressures were no less severe. Along the northern borders, Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks began to push against the Roman frontier, exploiting the empire's stretched resources. To the east, the Persian Sassanid Empire rose as a formidable rival, claiming victories that further undermined Roman prestige. For instance, in 260 CE, Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persian king Shapur I, a humiliation that highlighted Rome's declining military dominance. Amidst this turmoil, the empire attempted to reform. In 284 CE, Diocletian ascended to power, implementing sweeping changes to stabilize the crumbling state. He introduced the Tetrarchy, dividing the empire into 4 administrative regions, each governed by an emperor or a subordinate Caesar, to better manage its vast territories. This system provided temporary relief, but also laid the groundwork for the eventual split between the Eastern and Western Roman empires. The Western Empire faced the brunt of these challenges, compounded by internal decay. By the 4th century, economic disparity had widened, with an overburdened peasantry struggling under the weight of taxation and debt. Urban centers, once bustling hubs of trade and administration, began to decline as local economies became more self-sufficient and isolated. Meanwhile, Rome's reliance on foreign mercenaries to staff its legions further strained its resources and diluted its military cohesion. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self, beset by barbarian incursions and internal dissent. The culmination of these factors came in 476 CE, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. Though this date is often cited as the fall of Rome, the empire's decline was a drawn-out process, marked by centuries of systemic erosion. In truth, the fall was less a dramatic collapse and more a transformation, a shift from the centralized authority of Rome to a fragmented medieval Europe. The story of Rome's fall is not simply one of decline, but also one of reinvention. From the ruins of the ancient world arose new political systems, cultural identities, and economic structures that would shape the course of European history. By understanding the intricate web of events and decisions that led to Rome's fall, we gain insight not only into the fragility of empires, but also into the enduring legacy of one of history's greatest civilizations. The Roman Empire reached its zenith during the reign of Emperor Trajan, 98 to 117 CE. At this time, Rome controlled over 5 million square kilometers of territory, stretching from Britain in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the east and encompassing the entire Mediterranean basin. This immense expanse brought wealth and cultural diversity, as well as challenges in administration and defense. The population of the empire, estimated at 60 to 70 million, benefited from a relatively stable economy and efficient governance under the Pax Romana, a period of peace lasting over 2 centuries, beginning with Augustus in 27 BCE. Roman society thrived during this golden age. Cities like Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch boasted populations exceeding hundreds of thousands, with Rome itself housing approximately 1 million residents at its peak. Infrastructure was the backbone of this prosperity, as the empire constructed over 400,000 kilometers of roads, 80,000 of which were paved, facilitating trade, troop movements, and cultural exchange. Engineering marvels like aqueducts ensured the supply of fresh water to urban centers, while monumental structures such as the Colosseum and the Pantheon symbolized Roman ingenuity and power. Yet beneath the surface of this prosperity, systemic vulnerabilities began to emerge. Centralized governance relied heavily on the emperor's ability to maintain stability, and succession crises frequently destabilized the empire. Augustus had attempted to address this by creating a hereditary model of succession, but it often failed. The death of an emperor was frequently followed by power struggles among generals, senators, and claimants to the throne. For instance, following the death of Emperor Nero in 68 CE, Rome endured the tumultuous year of the 4 emperors, during which Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian successively claimed power. Economic issues also began to develop during this period. The immense wealth brought in by conquests began to wane as territorial expansion slowed in the 2nd century CE. Conquests, which had previously been a source of slaves, wealth, and resources, could no longer offset the empire's mounting expenses. The costs of maintaining the legions, estimated at 300,000 to 400,000 soldiers, and the vast network of roads, cities, and defenses began to outstrip revenues. The empire increasingly relied on heavy taxation, which disproportionately affected the rural poor, causing widespread discontent and rural depopulation. The empire's military dominance, while formidable, began to show signs of strain. To secure the empire's vast borders, Rome established fortifications such as Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, completed in 122 CE, and the Limes Germanicus along the Rhine. However, these measures were defensive rather than expansionist, signaling a shift in Rome's strategy. Simultaneously, the empire's reliance on non-Roman recruits and mercenaries introduced cracks in the military's cohesion. By the 3rd century CE, entire units were composed of soldiers with little connection to Roman culture or loyalty to the emperor. Culturally, Rome faced a gradual shift in values that further weakened its societal cohesion. The traditional Roman virtues of courage, duty, and discipline began to erode as wealth concentrated in the hands of elites, and the gap between rich and poor widened. Elite landowners amassed vast estates called latifundia, often operated by tenant farmers or slaves, while smallholder farmers, the backbone of the early Roman economy, struggled to compete. This economic disparity undermined social stability and bred resentment among the lower classes. One of the most significant factors in the seeds of decline was Rome's dependence on its centralized structure. The empire was held together by the emperor's authority, the loyalty of the legions, and the efficiency of the bureaucracy. However, this centralization also meant that when crises occurred, be it economic, political, or military, the entire system was vulnerable to collapse. For example, when Emperor Commodus was assassinated, it plunged the empire into a period of chaos known as the Year of the Five Emperors in 193 CE. The inability to establish clear and peaceful transfers of power became a recurring issue, leaving the empire exposed to internal strife and external threats. Additionally, the empire's vast size posed logistical challenges. The time it took to relay orders and move troops across such a large area hindered efficient governance. For instance, it could take weeks for messages to travel from the imperial court in Rome to the frontiers along the Rhine or Danube. This logistical delay often left border regions vulnerable to incursions while reinforcements were mobilized. By the late 2nd century, the Antonine Plague, 165 to 180 CE, brought back by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east, ravaged the population. Estimates suggest that the pandemic may have killed 10 to 20% of the empire's inhabitants, significantly reducing its tax base and military recruitment pool. This devastating blow underscored how interconnected vulnerabilities could destabilize even the strongest empire. The seeds of Rome's decline were thus sown during its golden age. Political instability, economic strain, military overreach, and shifting cultural values began to erode the foundations of the empire. What appeared to be a flourishing and invincible superpower concealed deep and systemic weaknesses that would take centuries to manifest fully, but would ultimately lead to its dramatic fall. The Roman Empire's economy, once the engine of its prosperity, began to falter as early as the 3rd century CE. A combination of over-reliance on taxation, monetary instability, and systemic inequality created a fragile foundation that could not withstand the growing pressures of the empire's vast scale and external threats. The social fabric of the empire, deeply intertwined with its economic systems, also began to unravel as inequality deepened and key sectors of Roman society were hollowed out. One of the most critical aspects of Rome's economic decline was its heavy taxation system, which disproportionately burdened the rural peasantry. By the 3rd century, much of the empire's wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small, elite class of senators, equestrians, and landowners who managed sprawling estates known as latifundia. Meanwhile, small-scale farmers, who had been the backbone of the early Roman economy, faced mounting taxes and were often forced to abandon their lands. As a result, the empire saw the proliferation of agri deserti, or deserted farmlands. By the reign of Diocletian, 284 to 305 CE, significant portions of previously productive land across Gaul, North Africa, and the Balkans had been abandoned due to overtaxation and economic mismanagement. The monetary system of the empire also suffered severe destabilization during this period. Under the pressures of funding military campaigns and sustaining a bloated bureaucracy, the Roman government resorted to debasing its currency. The denarius, once the cornerstone of Roman commerce, had been steadily reduced in silver content since the reign of Nero, 54 to 68 CE. By the 3rd century, under emperors such as Gallienus, 253 to 268 CE, the denarius contained as little as 2% silver, rendering it nearly worthless. Inflation skyrocketed, and the empire faced a crisis of confidence in its currency. This monetary instability severely disrupted trade and eroded the wealth of ordinary citizens who depended on stable currency for transactions. Trade, which had long been a pillar of Roman economic strength, began to decline as external threats and internal disruptions fractured the empire's interconnected economy. The Mediterranean, once referred to as Mare Nostrum, our sea by the Romans, became increasingly unsafe for merchant vessels due to piracy and naval instability. Overland trade routes, such as those connecting the eastern provinces to Rome, were frequently disrupted by invasions and local conflicts. This decline in trade forced many regions to become self-sufficient, further fragmenting the empire's economic unity. Urban centers, which had once been thriving hubs of economic activity, were particularly hard hit by these economic strains. Cities like Rome, which had a population of over 1 million at its peak, saw significant population declines by the 4th century. Urban decay was exacerbated by the inability of city governments to maintain infrastructure such as aqueducts, baths, and forums. By the 5th century, cities like Trier and Antioch, once symbols of Roman power, had lost much of their former glory, with populations declining by as much as 50%. The empire's reliance on slavery further compounded its economic woes. Slaves had been a critical component of the Roman economy, especially in agriculture and construction, but the supply of slaves dwindled as the empire's territorial expansion slowed in the 2nd century CE. With fewer slaves entering the system, the labor force became less efficient and the cost of maintaining large estates increased. The shift to a tenant farming system where colony worked the land in exchange for a share of the crops proved less productive and contributed to declining agricultural output. Demographic factors also played a significant role in the empire's economic struggles. The Antonine Plague, 165 to 180 CE, believed to have been smallpox or measles, killed an estimated 10 to 20% of the population, significantly reducing the empire's labor pool and tax base. This was followed by the Cyprian Plague, 249 to 262 CE, which further decimated the population, particularly in urban centers. These pandemics left vast stretches of land unworked and undermined the empire's ability to recover economically. Socially, the Roman Empire became increasingly stratified during this period. The gap between the wealthy elite and the impoverished masses widened, leading to social unrest. The elite classes, shielded from the burdens of taxation and enjoying vast privileges, grew increasingly detached from the needs of the general population. Meanwhile, the lower classes, particularly in rural areas, faced crippling poverty and insecurity. The peasantry, unable to sustain themselves under the weight of taxes and rents, often fled their lands to seek refuge under the protection of powerful landlords, effectively becoming serfs. This marked the beginning of the feudal system that would dominate medieval Europe. The state attempted to address these issues through heavy-handed reforms. Under Diocletian, efforts were made to stabilize the economy by introducing the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 CE, which aimed to curb inflation by setting fixed prices for goods and services. However, this measure largely failed, as it was impossible to enforce across the empire's vast territories, and it led to a thriving black market. Diocletian also restructured the tax system to increase revenues, but the reforms placed further burdens on the already struggling peasantry. Another significant reform was the centralization of labor. The state tied farmers to their land and craftsmen to their trades through hereditary laws, effectively creating a proto-feudal system. While these measures ensured a stable supply of agricultural and manufactured goods, they also stifled social mobility and innovation, creating a rigid and oppressive economic structure. By the 4th century, the Roman economy had entered a state of stagnation, marked by declining agricultural output, reduced trade, and a shrinking population. These economic and social strains weakened the empire's ability to respond to external threats and internal crises. The ruralization of society, the decay of urban centers, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few elites created a fragmented and unstable system that was ill-equipped to support the empire's vast military and bureaucratic apparatus. As these strains intensified, they eroded the cohesion of Roman society, leaving it vulnerable to the cataclysmic events of the 5th century. The Roman military was once the empire's greatest strength, an unmatched force that expanded and defended its borders for centuries. However, by the late empire, the military had become both a symbol of Rome's might and a reflection of its weaknesses. The pressures of maintaining vast frontiers, combined with the increasing reliance on foreign recruits and internal mismanagement, eroded the cohesion and effectiveness of the once dominant legions. These issues were compounded by relentless external threats, which exploited the empire's vulnerabilities and contributed significantly to its eventual collapse. The empire's territorial expanse posed a monumental challenge. By the 2nd century CE, Rome's borders stretched for over 15,000 kilometers, encompassing the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north, the deserts of North Africa in the south, and the Euphrates River in the east. Maintaining these borders required a permanent military presence of approximately 300,000 to 400,000 soldiers. As the empire faced economic difficulties, the costs of funding such a large force became unsustainable, leading to reduced troop numbers and declining morale. A turning point came in the 3rd century CE during the crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 CE. Civil wars, rapid changes in leadership, and economic instability left the frontiers vulnerable to incursions. The Goths, a Germanic people, crossed the Danube in 238 CE and raided the Balkans, reaching as far as Greece. Simultaneously, the Persian Sassanid Empire in the east launched devastating attacks, capturing key cities such as Antioch and even taking Emperor Valerian prisoner in 260 CE. These events exposed the empire's inability to defend its borders effectively, further encouraging external aggressors. The late 4th century witnessed a series of barbarian migrations and invasions that fundamentally reshaped the Roman world. The arrival of the Huns, a nomadic group from Central Asia, in the 370s CE displaced many Germanic tribes, forcing them to seek refuge within Roman territory. In 376 CE, the Visigoths, led by their king Fritigern, were allowed to cross the Danube into Roman lands, ostensibly as allies. However, mistreatment by Roman officials led to the Visigoths rebelling, culminating in the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE. At Adrianople, the Roman army, led by Emperor Valens, suffered one of its most significant defeats, with 2/3 of its forces annihilated. Valens himself was killed, and the loss marked a turning point, shattering the perception of Roman invincibility. The aftermath of Adrianople revealed the empire's growing reliance on barbarian troops. Lacking sufficient Roman recruits, the military increasingly turned to federati, barbarian groups granted land and status in exchange for military service. While this strategy temporarily bolstered the empire's defenses, it also introduced divisions within the ranks, as these groups often prioritized their own interests over those of Rome. For instance, the Visigoths, now established within Roman territory, continued to operate semi-independently under their own leaders, culminating in the sack of Rome in 410 CE under King Alaric. Rome's inability to contain barbarian incursions was further exacerbated by internal mismanagement. Emperors and generals frequently diverted resources from frontier defenses to address internal power struggles, leaving border regions exposed. This neglect allowed groups like the Vandals, Suebi, and Alans to cross the Rhine in 406 CE, initiating a wave of migrations and conquests across Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. By 439 CE, the Vandals, under their leader Gallagher, had captured Carthage, a critical economic and naval hub, effectively cutting off Rome from vital grain supplies. The Huns, under their infamous leader Attila, posed an even greater threat during the mid-5th century. By 450 CE, Attila's campaigns had devastated large swaths of Europe, including Gaul and northern Italy. Although his advance was checked at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 CE, a coalition of Romans and Visigoths managed to halt his forces. Attila's invasions highlighted the empire's reliance on fragile alliances and its inability to act independently. As the Western Roman Empire faltered, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, managed to survive, in part due to its wealth and strategic location. Emperors like Theodosius II fortified Constantinople with massive walls, known as the Theodosian Walls, which withstood multiple attacks, including those by the Huns. However, this division between the eastern and western halves of the empire left the West increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The Western Empire's fall in 476 CE, marked by the deposition of Romulus Augustulus by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, was the culmination of these military pressures. By this point, the Western Roman military was largely composed of barbarian mercenaries, and the Roman identity that had once unified the legions was all but lost. The Eastern Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive for centuries, but the Western Empire dissolved into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms, signaling the end of Roman dominion in the West. The military pressures faced by Rome were not merely the result of external forces, but were deeply rooted in the empire's internal decline. The over-reliance on foreign troops, the inability to adequately fund and maintain its legions, and the neglect of its frontiers all contributed to the empire's vulnerabilities. These pressures, compounded by economic and social strains, ultimately rendered the Western Roman Empire incapable of withstanding the relentless tide of barbarian invasions. The leadership of the Roman Empire during its later years was marked by a mixture of reform, mismanagement, and political instability. While some emperors implemented significant measures to stabilize the empire, these efforts were often undermined by systemic issues, factionalism, and internal divisions. The emperor, once seen as the stabilizing force of the Roman state, increasingly became a symbol of its fragility. One of the most critical attempts at reform came during the reign of Diocletian, 284–305 CE. Faced with the immense challenge of governing a sprawling empire plagued by civil wars and external threats, Diocletian implemented sweeping changes to the structure of Roman governance. Recognizing that a single ruler could no longer manage such vast territories, he introduced the Tetrarchy in 293 CE. Dividing the empire into 4 administrative regions. 2 senior emperors, or Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, or Caesars, ruled jointly. Diocletian and Maximian ruled as Augusti, while Galerius and Constantius Chlorus served as Caesars. This division was intended to bring stability by delegating power and ensuring a smoother transition of authority. However, while the Tetrarchy temporarily resolved succession crises, it also institutionalized the division of the empire, setting the stage for its eventual split into eastern and western halves. Diocletian also sought to address the empire's economic woes. He restructured the tax system, basing assessments on land and population to ensure a more predictable revenue stream. Additionally, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 CE to combat inflation by setting fixed prices for goods and wages. Despite these efforts, the edict largely failed due to widespread non-compliance and enforcement challenges, further undermining the economy. Following Diocletian's abdication in 305 CE, the Tetrarchic system began to unravel. A series of power struggles ensued, culminating in the rise of Constantine the Great, 306–337 CE. Constantine's reign marked another pivotal moment in Roman history. After defeating his rival Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, Constantine consolidated power and became the sole ruler of the empire by 324 CE. His reign is most notable for his embrace of Christianity. In 313 CE, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians and ending centuries of persecution. By the time of his death in 337 CE, Christianity had become deeply entrenched within the Roman state, culminating in its adoption as the empire's official religion under Emperor Theodosius in 380 CE. While Constantine's reforms brought short-term stability, they also introduced new challenges. The shift toward Christianity alienated many traditional Roman elites who viewed the abandonment of pagan rituals as a betrayal of Rome's cultural heritage. Furthermore, the centralization of power in Constantinople, which Constantine established as the new capital in 330 CE, weakened the Western Empire. Constantinople's strategic location allowed it to thrive as a hub of trade and defense, but it also diverted resources and attention away from Rome and the Western provinces. Theodosius I, 379 to 395 CE, the last emperor to rule both the Eastern and Western empires, furthered the Christianization of Rome, but also presided over a growing division between the two halves of the empire. Upon his death in 395 CE, the empire was permanently split between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This division, while administrative, exacerbated the disparities between the more prosperous and defensible Eastern Empire and the struggling Western Empire. The East, with its wealthier provinces and fortified capital, was better equipped to withstand invasions, while the West, lacking comparable resources, became increasingly vulnerable to barbarian incursions. Leadership in the Western Empire deteriorated significantly during the 5th century. Emperors in the West were often little more than puppets controlled by powerful generals or barbarian leaders. For example, the young Emperor Romulus Augustulus, who reigned from 475 to 476 CE, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, marking the symbolic end of the Western Roman Empire. Odoacer's rise underscored the extent to which Roman authority had eroded. The empire that had once dictated terms to the world now relied on barbarian leaders to maintain order. Factionalism within the Roman elite further weakened the empire's cohesion. The Senate, once the heart of Roman political life, had been reduced to a ceremonial role by the imperial period. By the 4th and 5th centuries, it had become largely irrelevant, its members unable to exert meaningful influence over the emperor or the state. Rivalries between generals and governors, often exacerbated by ethnic divisions within the empire, created a cycle of civil wars that drained resources and diverted attention from external threats. For instance, during the reign of Honorius, 393 to 423 CE, the empire faced multiple usurpations, including that of Constantine III in Britain, whose rebellion further weakened Rome's hold on its western provinces. The weakening of centralized authority also led to the rise of regional powers. In some cases, local leaders took it upon themselves to defend their territories from barbarian invasions. This decentralization of power marked the beginning of the feudal system, which would define medieval Europe. However, it also signaled the empire's inability to maintain a unified identity and purpose. By the late 5th century, the Western Empire had become a patchwork of territories controlled by barbarian kingdoms, each carving out its own domain within the former Roman provinces. The Eastern Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive, preserving much of Roman culture and governance, but the West had succumbed to fragmentation and decline. The internal divisions within the Roman Empire were a direct result of its sheer size, economic challenges, and the inability of its leaders to adapt to changing circumstances. While some emperors attempted to enact meaningful reforms, these efforts were often undermined by the deeply entrenched issues of factionalism, economic disparity, and external pressures. Ultimately, the failure of leadership and the divisions within the empire rendered it incapable of withstanding the crises that led to its fall. The fall of the Roman Empire was not a single catastrophic event, but a gradual process that unfolded over centuries. By the 5th century CE, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self, weakened by internal divisions, economic collapse, and relentless external pressures. The year 476 CE, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is often cited as the symbolic end of the empire. However, this event was the culmination of a long decline, rather than an abrupt collapse. The Western Empire's fall was marked by significant milestones. The sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 CE was one of the first major shocks. Led by their king Alaric, the Visigoths plundered the city for 3 days, sending shockwaves throughout the Roman world. Rome, once seen as the eternal city, had not been sacked in over 800 years. This event shattered the illusion of Rome's invulnerability and highlighted the empire's inability to protect its heartland. The Vandals dealt another blow in 455 CE when they sacked Rome again. Under their leader, Gallagher, the Vandals not only looted the city, but also dismantled its infrastructure. The term vandalism originates from this event, symbolizing the destruction associated with their campaign. The loss of Rome's wealth and the psychological impact of these sackings further eroded the Western Empire's authority. Meanwhile, barbarian tribes carved out territories within the empire's borders. The Visigoths settled in Gaul and later Spain, the Vandals established a kingdom in North Africa, and the Ostrogoths took control of Italy. Each of these groups established their own rule while nominally acknowledging the authority of the Roman emperor. However, this recognition was largely symbolic, as real power had shifted to the barbarian kings and their armies. The final act came in 476 CE, when Odoacer, a Germanic general in the Roman army, deposed the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer declared himself ruler of Italy and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, signaling the end of the Western Roman Empire. Unlike previous usurpers, Odoacer did not seek to replace Romulus with another Roman emperor, effectively ending the line of Western emperors. Despite the political collapse of the West, the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, endured for nearly another 1,000 years. Centered in Constantinople, the Eastern Empire was wealthier, more urbanized, and better fortified than its Western counterpart. Emperors like Justinian I, 527 to 565 CE, sought to reclaim the former glory of Rome by reconquering lost territories in the West. Justinian's campaigns briefly restored imperial control over parts of North Africa, Italy, and Spain, but these gains were short-lived. The aftermath of Rome's fall was a period of profound transformation. The so-called Dark Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 10th centuries, were characterized by the decline of urban life, the fragmentation of political authority, and the rise of feudalism. Cities that had once been bustling centers of trade and administration shrank or were abandoned. For example, Rome's population, which had peaked at over 1 million in the 2nd century CE, fell to fewer than 50,000 by the 9th century. Similarly, Trier, a major city in Roman Gaul, saw its population decline from an estimated 80,000 to just a few thousand. Feudalism emerged as the dominant social and political system in post-Roman Europe. Local lords and kings filled the power vacuum left by Rome's collapse, offering protection to peasants in exchange for labor and allegiance. This decentralized system of governance replaced the centralized authority of the Roman Empire and laid the foundation for medieval Europe. The Roman Catholic Church also rose to prominence during this period, becoming the primary unifying force in the West. The Church preserved much of the Roman Empire's intellectual and cultural heritage through its monasteries and clerical institutions. Figures such as Saint Benedict, 480 to 547 CE, and the monastic communities he inspired played a crucial role in preserving classical texts and promoting education. Economically, the collapse of Rome disrupted long-distance trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean world. Regions became increasingly self-sufficient, relying on local resources rather than imported goods. However, this period also saw the emergence of new trade routes and economies. For instance, the Viking and Islamic worlds contributed to a resurgence in trade by the 9th and 10th centuries, setting the stage for Europe's eventual economic revival. Culturally, the fall of Rome marked the end of classical antiquity and the beginning of the medieval period. While many aspects of Roman culture were lost, others were adapted and preserved. The Latin language, for example, evolved into the Romance languages spoken across Europe today. Roman law influenced the development of legal systems throughout Europe, and Roman architectural styles inspired medieval and Renaissance builders. The legacy of Rome's fall is profound. It serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of empires and the dangers of overextension, internal division, and economic mismanagement. Yet it also demonstrates the resilience of human societies. From the ashes of Rome arose a new world, one that would eventually give birth to the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the modern age. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the rise, decline, and enduring legacy of the Roman Empire. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the world's most fascinating historical events. Until next time, remember, history isn't just the story of the past, it's the foundation of our present. Please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the world's most fascinating historical events.